I left campus late on December 23rd because finals ended late and I wanted to wake up at home on Christmas morning. I had already done the drive twice that year, 12 hours if nothing went wrong. Overnight driving kept traffic light and let me avoid weather systems moving in from the west. I packed coffee, jerky, and the last of my gas money. The car was old but dependable. I trusted it more than I trusted myself after finals week. By midnight the road flattened into long straight stretches broken only by exit signs and mile markers. Christmas stations faded in and out as I crossed signal dead zones. Snow had not been in the forecast. The sky stayed clear until around 2:40 in the morning, when the headlights began catching flakes that looked too large to ignore. They were wet and heavy, drifting sideways, sticking to the windshield instead of blowing past. The temperature dropped fast. The road darkened as snow collected between tire tracks. I slowed to just under the speed limit and turned the radio off to focus. The drive had become quiet in the way only night highways can be. No oncoming headlights. No taillights ahead. Just the engine hum and the scrape of wipers. A green sign appeared without warning on the right. Rest area 1 mile. I did not remember seeing it before, but I had driven this route during the day every other time. Snowfall thickened, enough that the shoulder blurred into the trees. I did not want to stop, but my hands were stiff and my eyes burned from caffeine and strain. I decided to pull in for 10 minutes, reset, then continue. The exit ramp curved sharply downhill. Snow had already covered the painted lines. At the bottom sat a small parking loop with a low concrete building and a row of darkened vending machines. No lights were on. The building looked old. I pulled into a space near the end, facing out. Another car sat across from me. A sedan, dark color, parked crooked, front wheels turned slightly. The engine was running. No headlights. No interior light. Exhaust rose in a steady stream and disappeared into the snow. That made me uneasy, but not enough to leave. I stayed in my car, locked the doors, set the parking brake. I checked the time. 3:02 a.m. I scrolled through messages on my phone and turned the heater to low so the windows would not fog. I ate a granola bar and took small sips of coffee. The snow piled faster than expected, hissing against the glass. After a few minutes, I noticed the side mirror had fogged. I wiped it with my sleeve through the open window an inch, then closed it again. Cold air rushed in. I watched my breath hang inside the car. The mirror clouded again almost immediately. I assumed it was condensation from the temperature difference. I wiped the windshield with my sleeve. It cleared, then hazed over again, not evenly but in soft oval patches, as if someone had breathed on it. That was when I realized the fog was on the outside. The inside glass stayed clear. The fog formed only where the headlights shone across the surface. It appeared, faded, then appeared again a few inches to the side. I did not move. I did not turn my head. I watched the pattern shift slowly from the windshield to the passenger window. The sound came next. Not a tap, not a scrape, just breath. Slow, even, close enough that it made the glass vibrate slightly. I froze in a way I had never experienced. My body locked without instruction. My hands rested on the steering wheel. My feet stayed flat on the floor. I controlled my breathing until it hurt. The breath moved along the passenger window, paused, then continued toward the rear. I could see the fog bloom and disappear. Each time it returned, it left a faint clean arc where snow had melted and refrozen. I stared straight ahead. The other car stayed where it was. Its engine continued to idle. No door opened. No light came on. The breath returned, now on the driver's side window. It was lower, closer to my lap. The fog spread in a wide shape, then cleared. It came back again, slower this time, as if the person was pacing their breathing to mine. I thought about starting the engine and driving through the snowbank. I thought about honking. I thought about grabbing my phone. None of those thoughts reached my hands. The breathing moved toward the windshield again, centered this time, right in front of my face. I stared through the fog and imagined a shape inches away that I refused to define. The smell reached me next. Damp wool, cold air, something metallic like old coins. Minutes passed without change. My muscles burned from tension. My jaw ached from clenching. The heater clicked on and off. I feared the sound would draw attention, but the breathing never sped up or reacted. Eventually the fog stopped appearing. The glass stayed clear. The snow continued to fall. I waited. The sky lightened slowly, turning from black to deep blue. The snow eased. My legs cramped. I did not look around. I did not check mirrors. I waited until I could see my hands without the dash lights. When the sun finally rose above the tree line, the rest stop looked smaller and older than it had at night. The building was boarded up. Snow covered the entrance entirely. A rusted sign leaned near the lot entrance, half buried. I turned my head and looked at the other car. It was empty. The driver door stood open an inch. The keys hung in the ignition. The back seat was stacked with wrapped boxes, holiday paper damp from condensation. A stocking lay on the floorboard. There were footprints in the snow. Many of them. They circled both cars. They pressed close to my doors. They led toward the trees, then back again, overlapping, confused, as if someone had walked in loops for hours. I started the engine and drove out without getting out of the car. The road was clear enough to manage. I did not stop again until daylight was full and traffic returned. I reached home late that afternoon. I told my family the drive had been rough. I did not mention the rest stop. 2 days later, I called the state police office listed on the highway website. I asked about the rest area near mile marker 312. The person on the phone sounded confused, then put me on hold. When they returned, they told me the rest stop had been decommissioned in 2003. Structural issues. No utilities. No maintenance. The exit remained on some older maps, but was supposed to be blocked. Snow often hid the barricades. They said a stolen vehicle had been found there that morning. The owner had reported it missing with gifts inside. No sign of the driver. No signs of a struggle. No footprints worth tracking after the snow melted. They asked if I had stopped there. I said no. I understood later what had likely happened. Someone had been stranded or hiding. Someone using a running car as bait. Someone counting on fatigue and whether to make people pull in. Someone testing doors. Breathing close enough to feel for movement. Waiting for panic. I think they stayed outside my car all night because I did not react. I did not give them anything to respond to. When daylight came, they left on foot, taking nothing, leaving the car behind because it no longer mattered. Every Christmas since, I drive during the day. I do not stop at rest areas I do not recognize. When snow starts falling at night, I keep going until there are lights and people and open buildings. I still remember the sound of breathing on glass. Not fast, not angry, patient, certain. I had been driving ice roads for a few seasons, hauling supplies to remote northern communities, and I thought I had a solid sense of how the landscape worked. December in northern Canada is a different world. The snow sits thick, the air is sharp enough to cut through layers of wool, and the light itself behaves differently, turning from pale gray to white with the sun barely cresting the horizon. I was on a long haul, a run that paid well because it was dangerous, equipment, groceries, fuel, everything a small town needed before the holidays. My rig was heavy, the trailer stacked with insulated crates, and the engine hummed beneath me, steady, dependable, the only rhythm I had to rely on for the next 12 hours. The road was frozen solid, a river of ice carved through the forest, barely wide enough for one truck in some stretches, with deep snow on either side that could swallow a vehicle whole if you misjudged the edge. I drove at a cautious speed, headlights cutting a clean path through the darkness, the rest of the world reduced to shadows and white. The radio was on, a low hum of static and distant voices from dispatch, but somewhere after 10 o'clock, the signal began to crackle differently. Not voices from other drivers, not any familiar chatter. It was fragmented, sometimes a syllable, sometimes a word, always broken. I turned the volume down, trying to convince myself it was just interference, the cold playing tricks on the electronics. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a ribbon of ice that reflected the moonlight in an almost liquid way. The silence between crackles was heavier than any noise. At one point, I noticed movement at the edge of the headlights. Something tall, pacing just beyond the reach of light. I froze for a second, gripping the wheel tighter, telling myself it was a trick of the shadows or maybe a reflection from a drift. The shape stayed with me, keeping pace. I accelerated, trying to put distance between me and whatever it was, but it didn't falter. The ice beneath me groaned, tires gripping, the trailer swaying slightly with the curves in the road. The figure, or whatever it was, stayed parallel, moving like it understood the path, always just outside the cone of light. It wasn't running, not exactly, just matching my speed, silent. Hours passed. The air inside the cab grew cold despite the heater running full blast. Frost crept along the edges of the windshield, and the smell of diesel mixed with the faint metallic tang of cold steel. The radio intermittently crackled again, snippets of words and letters I couldn't make sense of. But every time I tried to focus, the noise would fade back into static. The loneliness settled over me. Out here, the nearest human could be hours away, and the ice road can be unforgiving. One slip, one misjudgment, and there would be no one around to help. Eventually, I reached the checkpoint, the lights of the small station appearing faintly in the distance through the snow haze. I slowed, relieved but also uneasy. The workers waved me in with a mix of curiosity and concern. According to the log, I had arrived hours early. That couldn't be right. The dashboard GPS showed a continuous trip, the numbers moving forward without pause. But the time indicated that what should have taken 10 hours had passed in 7. There were no stretches I could have skipped, no hidden shortcuts. My mind tried to reconcile it, the eerie feeling tightening like a coil in my chest. They inspected the trailer, looking at the manifests and the crates, and that's when they noticed the handprints. Clear, elongated smudges pressed into the frost on the metal walls of the trailer. Not human, not in proportion, not in shape. I remembered nothing touching the walls, nothing brushing against the cargo. I had made every stop I was supposed to, checked every latch, secured every load. And yet there they were, lined along the inside of the trailer doors as if someone or something had been running their hands along the surface. The workers were quiet, exchanging glances but saying nothing to me directly. I stared at the prints, tracing them with my finger without touching, my breath misting in the cold. They didn't match anyone on staff, and no one admitted to seeing anything along the route. I felt the weight of it in my gut, the long hours on the ice replaying in my head, the shapes in the shadows just outside the headlights. The drive back was slower, deliberate. I kept thinking about what had paced me alongside the truck, matching my speed so precisely. It couldn't have been an animal. No creature I knew would move that way, silently, in perfect step, staying just beyond light. And yet it wasn't supernatural. That was a comfort and a terror at the same time. Everything I had seen and felt could be explained by something physical, something real, but it didn't make sense. It shouldn't have been possible. The ice road didn't bend time, and yet my instruments said otherwise. My mind cycled through every option: exhaustion, stress, hallucination, interference with the GPS, errors in the checkpoint logs. Every explanation felt incomplete. I spent the night at the small cabin they offered, curled into a cot with a thick blanket, the heater rattling in the background. Outside, the wind tore through the gaps in the walls, a hollow, whining sound that reminded me of the silence on the ice. I kept thinking about the handprints, the pacing shape, the lost hours. I went over the manifest in my head repeatedly, checking every detail I could remember. Everything matched, everything was accounted for, yet the anomaly persisted. Sleep came in short bursts, dreams half-formed and jagged, my mind replaying the road, the snow, the shadow moving in time with me. By morning, I forced myself to start the return trip to the main base. The frost on the windows had melted slightly in the brief warmth of the cabin, but the landscape outside was just as desolate. Driving back, I took extra care, scanning the tree line and ice with every turn of the headlights. Nothing appeared. The shape from the night before didn't re-emerge. The radio stayed quiet, only the usual dispatch chatter cutting through the static. I felt relief, but it was uneasy, a lingering awareness that something had been there, tangible, silent, and perfectly real. When I finally reached the main compound, I reported the prints and the missing time. The technicians checked the GPS logs and the camera footage from the checkpoint, finding anomalies in the timestamps, brief moments where the signal jumped, as if the instruments had been briefly displaced or delayed. They didn't try to explain the figure pacing the truck. They didn't need to. The evidence was enough to make anyone question what could survive out there, moving in perfect coordination with a truck over hours of freezing darkness. I returned home after that run, Christmas approaching, but I couldn't shake the memory of the road. The rhythm of the engine, the hiss of tires on ice, the crackle of the radio, and the shadow that followed, pacing silently just outside the light. It stayed with me not because it was impossible, but because it was real. Everything about it could exist in the world, yet it refused to conform to reason. I didn't take that route again, not on Christmas or any other time, and I avoided solo runs along frozen rivers. The ice road had shown me that the North doesn't just punish carelessness. It can present the impossible, tangible, and entirely real, and you have no choice but to respect it. The handprints, the lost hours, the pacing shadow, all remained part of the record, documented but unexplained, a cold warning from a place where winter owns everything. We went snowshoeing because it was cheap, not because we knew what we were doing. It was December 27th, the empty stretch after Christmas when the money was gone and the year felt stalled. There were 4 of us, all in our early 20s, sharing a rented car that smelled like fast food and wet fabric. We were staying with friends in Flagstaff and trying to stretch the last of our cash before classes and jobs started again. Ski passes were out of reach. Snowshoes were not. The rental shop was small and tired. The clerk barely looked at us. We signed a waiver without reading it and loaded the gear into the trunk. The snowshoes were scratched and dull, bindings stiff from age. The clerk warned us the trailhead we picked was not maintained in winter. We nodded like that meant something to us. It didn't. We wanted photos, a thermos with cheap whiskey, a reason to feel like we were doing something instead of waiting for life to begin. The drive out took longer than expected. The road narrowed and turned to packed snow. Pine forest closed in on both sides. The sky stayed low and gray, heavy but calm. No wind. No falling snow yet. The trailhead was unmarked except for a bent post half buried in white. No other cars. That should have mattered. It didn't. We strapped on the snowshoes and laughed at how awkward we looked. Our jackets were mismatched. Gloves thin. The thermos went into one pack, camera into another. Phones were already losing battery in the cold. The trail was visible at first, a shallow depression winding between trees. Someone had passed through earlier that week, maybe longer. The prints were softened by time, but still readable. The forest was quiet in the way winter forests are quiet. Not peaceful, just empty. Every sound we made felt sharp. The crunch of snowshoes, breath through scarves, the squeak of straps. We walked close together, joking with our bodies, bumping shoulders, moving too fast. The plan was simple. Walk a short loop, take photos, drink a little, head back before dark. About 40 minutes in, the weather shifted without warning. Snow began to fall straight down, thick flakes with no wind behind them. The sky dimmed fast. The trail softened. The older prints blurred and vanished. Markers that might have been there were gone, swallowed whole. We slowed without talking about it. The forest closed ranks. Trees stood closer together. The ground rose and dipped in ways that no longer matched what we remembered. That was when I noticed the rhythm. At first it felt like nothing, just a sense of movement that was not ours. Snowshoes make a distinct sound, a wide, flat press, then a drag. I heard that sound, then another one just slightly off. Same pace, same spacing, always to the side, never behind, never ahead. I assumed it was one of us, out of sync. I adjusted my steps. The sound adjusted too. I looked left. Trees. Right. More trees. Snow falling thicker now, muting distance. I told myself sound travels strangely in snow. That it bends. That it lies. I focused on breathing. The others were quiet now. Not scared yet. Just aware that things had changed. We stopped to check a map that no longer made sense. The moment we stopped, everything stopped. No snowshoe sounds. No shifting branches. No wind through needles. The snowfall continued, but even that seemed muted, like it was happening somewhere else. The silence pressed in. My ears rang. I became aware of my heartbeat, loud and uneven. When we started moving again, the sound returned. That same matched rhythm, close enough to feel but far enough to hide. Not following, walking alongside, keeping pace like it had a reason to be there. I told myself it was another group, someone on a parallel trail. But there were no trails, just trees and white ground. The idea of someone choosing to walk that close without showing themselves felt wrong. I tried to catch movement between trunks. I saw nothing, just falling snow and dark vertical lines. Time stretched. The light faded to blue-gray. The forest felt deeper, heavier. Our breath fogged thick and slow. We drank from the thermos without ceremony. The whiskey burned and did nothing else. The cold crept through boots and gloves. My toes began to ache, then fade. We should have turned back earlier. That thought repeated itself with every step. We had no clear sense of direction anymore. The ground sloped downward, then up again. The trees thinned, then crowded. The matched footsteps stayed with us, steady and patient. At one point Mark made a comment meant to break the tension, the kind of thing he always did when he felt uneasy. He aimed it outward, toward the woods, trying to name the fear and laugh it away. Before the echo could fade, the sound came back from the trees, not as an echo but as a copy. Same tone, same timing, same casual edge. It was his voice without his breath behind it. No one reacted out loud. No one laughed. No one answered. We kept walking because stopping felt worse. The snowshoe sounds resumed, ours and the other set, still matched, still close. My thoughts narrowed. Practical things surfaced. Sound can be mimicked. Hunters use calls. People play games. Acoustics in snow and trees can throw voices in strange ways. A person could walk parallel to us without being seen if they knew the terrain. None of that explained the precision. None of it explained why someone would choose to do this. Darkness settled fully. The forest became a wall of black shapes. Our headlamps cut narrow tunnels that reflected back flakes and branches. Every beam felt too small. The cold deepened. My fingers lost feeling. My jaw clenched to stop my teeth from shaking. We stayed close enough to touch. Packs brushed. Boots clipped snowshoes by accident. The matched footsteps stayed just outside the light. Always there. Never closer. Never farther. Eventually the ground leveled out. The trees thinned. The snow underfoot changed texture, packed harder. I smelled oil and metal before I saw anything. Then the headlamp beam caught a reflective strip. A guardrail. Asphalt under snow. We stumbled out onto the road without celebration. We didn't stop until we were well clear of the tree line. Only then did I look back. The forest stood still. No movement. No sound. Just snow falling and darkness between trunks. We made it to the car with numb hands and stiff legs. The heater took forever to warm the air. No one spoke on the drive back. No one suggested an explanation. We returned the snowshoes the next morning and left town a day early. Years later, I learned about a man who lived near that area at the time. He had a history of harassing hikers. He used voice imitation, practiced it, learned how to throw sound. He stayed just out of sight, never crossed lines that would get him caught. He was arrested months later after someone followed his tracks back to a cabin. The report mentioned snowshoes, a parallel walking pattern, and recorded calls that sounded exactly like the people he targeted. That explanation fits the facts. It explains the pacing, the mimicry, the choice of location. It explains why we were never approached, never chased. Fear was the point. Control was the point. I accept that. I need to. I still hear Mark's voice sometimes when I'm half asleep or walking alone. It never says anything new. It just sounds like him, casual and close, coming from somewhere it shouldn't. It was December 2002 when my brother insisted we go back to the cabin. He had been sick for months, the doctors giving nothing more than small, cautious hope, and he wanted one last Christmas like we used to have when we were kids. The cabin was in northern Minnesota, deep in the woods, reachable only by a long, snow-packed dirt road. He said it reminded him of simpler times, and I didn't argue. I packed the truck with wood, canned food, and enough blankets to bury us both under warmth, knowing that once the snow came down hard, we would be cut off. The drive north was long and silent. The trees pressed in on either side of the road, their branches heavy with ice and snow, glinting dimly in the pale winter light. No other cars were on the road, just the truck's tires crunching over frozen ruts. By the time we reached the cabin, the sky was dark, the sun gone behind thick clouds. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered, small and squat, made of weathered logs and a stone chimney that had seen better days. Snow lay thick on the roof, and the wind made the surrounding trees groan. The air was sharp, the cold pressing against my cheeks, and when I opened the door, it smelled of dry wood and dust. Inside, it was quiet. The furniture was sparse but familiar. An old couch with worn cushions, a small dining table scarred with years of use, a metal stove that had heated the place through many winters. I unpacked the food and stacked firewood by the stove while my brother wandered to the windows, staring out at the snow-laden forest. There was no cell service here, no television, only a small radio that caught one local station. It looped the same Christmas songs over and over, punctuated by weather warnings about drifting snow and icy roads. I set it to low, more for company than anything else, while we settled in. That first night, I woke to heavy footsteps. I lay frozen for a moment, trying to tell myself it was the house settling, ice shifting against the logs. My brother said the same thing when I mentioned it in passing, though he sounded tired, his voice weaker than usual. I didn't argue. We had enough to deal with without imagining threats in the dark. But the steps kept coming, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin in patterns that made no sense. They scraped against the logs, sometimes outside the walls, sometimes inside. It felt like someone was pacing, though no one could be there. I would lie awake, straining to hear the direction, the rhythm, anything, but the sound would shift, never staying in one place. By the second night, the noises had grown bolder. They circled the cabin, coming close to the windows, almost as if inspecting us. I checked the locks, the windows, every seam of the cabin. My brother didn't seem afraid, only restless, moving from room to room, as if the sounds guided him. Once, I found him at the door, staring out into the darkness, whispering words I couldn't understand. I thought it was a symptom of the illness, the fevered dreams that sometimes came with his condition. He didn't respond when I tried to get him back to bed, only murmured softly and turned back to the night. I spent that night near the stove, listening to the rain of ice against the roof and the persistent steps circling outside. The snow had come down hard, covering the trees in a thick white blanket that muted all sound except the creaking and groaning of branches. The cold pressed in, the cabin's walls thin against the wind. My sleep was shallow, punctuated by the sounds of scraping logs, steps that always seemed just beyond reach. I tried to tell myself it was the frost, the expansion of the logs, something ordinary. But ordinary didn't sound deliberate. The third night, it got worse. The sounds came inside the cabin. Heavy, deliberate scraping that followed me as I moved from room to room. The radio turned on briefly, static filling the air, a snippet of a carol drifting through before the station came back. My brother began to sleepwalk more insistently. I found him standing at the door again, whispering back into the night. His face was pale, the lines of his illness etched deep, and his eyes had a focus that unsettled me. He didn't respond when I approached, only muttered and pressed his hands against the cold wood, as if communicating with something beyond me. I stayed with him through the night, making sure he didn't fall or wander outside, feeling helpless against both the illness that weakened him and the strange agitation that seemed to grip him after dark. I began to notice details I hadn't before. The logs had hairline cracks, frozen sap that glistened in the firelight. The wind made low howls through the corners of the cabin, shadows stretching long and wavering against the walls. Every sound was sharper in the absence of civilization. The snapping of a branch outside, the soft settling of snow on the roof, the faint creak of the door when it shifted in its frame. I couldn't sleep, and every hour felt longer, marked by the deliberate rhythm of scraping, circling steps. By the time we left, the snow had blocked the road in both directions. I drove the truck slowly, plowing through deep drifts, my brother leaning weakly on the seat beside me. He never mentioned the nights, the footsteps, the strange obsession with the door. He was quiet, eyes fixed on the passing white landscape. 2 months later, he was gone. The doctors had done what they could, but the illness had taken him. I sometimes think of those nights, how the isolation, the cold, and the constant noise seemed to press against his mind and mine alike. Years later, when the temperature drops low enough, I swear I can hear the radio from the cabin. Static first, then a carol, faint and tinny, playing as if it had been left on a loop. I know it isn't supernatural. I know it isn't haunted. It's just the memory of that place, lodged so deep that my mind reconstructs the sounds of that cold, frozen cabin, the circling steps, the whispers at the door. I've never returned, but every winter, when the air is sharp and still, the radio comes back in my head, and I remember that last Christmas, the cold pressing in, the snow heavy on the roof, and the relentless, slow rhythm of the world outside that we couldn't escape. I hadn't planned on going back. The thought had lingered for months, nagging at the edges of my mind, but I always convinced myself it was better not to. The house was full of memories I didn't want to revisit, and I knew the weight of everything I had left behind would be heavier than I could bear. Still, my parents called repeatedly, urging me to come home for Christmas. They said it wouldn't feel right without me, that the holidays were incomplete without everyone gathered in the old living room, the tree lit, the smell of pine and baking lingering in the air. I finally agreed, more out of obligation than desire. The drive there felt longer than it used to. I watched the familiar landscape roll past the window, the uneven fences, the clusters of bare trees, the familiar dip in the road near the creek where I had fallen off my bike countless times. Everything was the same, and nothing was the same at all. When I turned onto the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered, almost fragile against the snow-dusted yard. The windows reflected the dim afternoon light, and I felt a strange hesitation, a pause in my chest, as if the house itself was aware I had returned. Walking through the door brought a rush of memories, warm and heavy. The floor creaked beneath my boots in the same way it always had. The smell was different, older, mustier, with a faint trace of the cinnamon and pine my mother always insisted on using for the holidays. I set my bag down in the hallway and took a moment to breathe, trying to reconcile the house in my memory with the one I was standing in now. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes with peace, but the kind that presses against your ears and makes you notice every tiny sound. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the wind rattling the thin window panes, the faint drip of water from the faucet in the kitchen. That night, I slept in my old room, the one at the end of the hall. The wallpaper was faded, and my bed looked smaller than I remembered, but I could still picture the posters I had plastered on the walls, the stacks of books on the floor, the small desk by the window where I had done my homework. I had barely closed my eyes when I noticed it, a faint noise, a shuffle, like someone was moving quietly in the corner. I froze. The sound was careful, deliberate, accompanied by slow, measured breathing. I convinced myself it was the house settling, that my mind was playing tricks, but the noise continued, soft and persistent. It wasn't loud enough to wake my parents, but it was close enough that I could feel the presence of it. I lay completely still, listening, until eventually the sound stopped. Morning arrived gray and cold. The house seemed to hold its breath with me, each step I took on the wooden floor echoing a little too sharply. I moved through the living room toward the tree, which my parents had decorated with the same ornaments I remembered from my childhood. The lights flickered gently, casting long shadows across the carpet. And there it was, a single gift, placed carefully under the tree, with my name written in my mother's familiar, looping handwriting. I stared at it for a long moment, my stomach twisting. Neither of my parents claimed it. They both looked at me with a neutral expression, as if they hadn't noticed it or didn't want to mention it. I knelt down slowly and unwrapped it. The paper was old and slightly torn at the edges, the ribbon faded. Inside was a small box, light enough to lift with one hand. When I opened it, my heart stopped. Inside was something I had buried behind the house when I was 9 years old. A clay figurine, crudely made, painted in bright colors that had faded over time. I remembered the exact afternoon I had dug the hole, the way the soil felt cold and damp against my fingers, the shame I had felt leaving it there as if it held all my secrets. I had assumed it had been lost to the earth or destroyed by weather, but here it was, perfectly preserved, placed deliberately where I would find it. A wave of unease washed over me. The house was quiet again, almost painfully so, but it no longer felt empty. The familiarity that had once been comforting now felt intrusive, as if the walls themselves were watching, waiting for my reaction. I didn't want to be there, not anymore. The childhood I had tried to hold on to, the innocence and security I had believed the house represented, had been replaced by something heavier, something that reminded me of how small and exposed I really was in that space. I left before breakfast. I didn't explain, didn't wait for my parents to notice, didn't try to make sense of why the figurine had been placed there. I packed my bag, wrapped my coat tightly around myself, and walked to my car, feeling the cold bite through the layers. Snow crunched under my boots, and each step away from the house felt like a release, like pulling the weight off my shoulders. I didn't look back. I didn't turn the key in the ignition until I was halfway down the driveway, and even then, I drove slowly, deliberately, savoring the distance I was putting between myself and that house. I haven't been back since. I know the house is still standing, still decorated, still full of the echoes of my childhood. I know my parents likely wonder why I don't visit, why I haven't returned for Christmas or any other holiday. I can't tell them it isn't about them. It isn't about nostalgia or memories or old traditions. It's about the way that place has changed, or maybe the way I have changed. That house holds things I buried long ago, things I thought I had left behind, and it reminded me that some parts of ourselves aren't meant to be dug up again. Driving away, I felt lighter than I had in years. The roads were empty, the sky overcast, and the snow lay in soft, thick layers across the fields. Each mile put me further from the weight of the house, further from the memories that pressed too tightly against my chest. By the time I reached the highway, I realized I would never go back. Some things are meant to stay buried, and some houses, no matter how familiar, are best left behind. The past isn't always safe to revisit, and sometimes leaving is the only way to survive. I still think about that gift, about the figurine, and the care with which it was returned to me. I don't understand why it was placed there, or why my parents didn't acknowledge it, but I don't want to know. Some truths aren't comforting, and some reminders are meant to scare you just enough to keep you away. I haven't returned, and I never will. I don't go home anymore. The house exists only in my memory now, a place I can think of from a distance, never close enough to touch. The snow-covered driveway, the faded wallpaper, the quiet room at the end of the hall. They live only in my mind, and that is enough. I have my own space now, my own life, and the past can stay exactly where it belongs. I drive past that old neighborhood when I need to remember what I escaped, keeping the house at the edge of my vision, distant and untouchable. That Christmas, I learned that home isn't always where your family is, and safety isn't always where you grew up. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, and some memories, once unearthed, demand that you never look back. I haven't. I won't. I don't go home anymore. I took the seasonal job at the tree farm in late November 2016. I had just finished a few months of temporary work in the city, and I wasn't ready to go home for the holidays. My parents were already busy with their own plans, and I wanted to avoid the familiar suffocating warmth of family traditions that never felt like my own. The farm was somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, tucked into the foothills of dense evergreens. Directions were vague, and the last few miles were gravel and mud, winding through forests so thick the trees blocked out much of the afternoon light. I arrived late in the day, my car coated with a thin layer of frost and mud, and the farm looked smaller than I expected. A low wooden cabin served as the main office, and beyond it, rows of pines and firs stretched into shadowed hills. The air smelled of cold sap and wet earth, sharp and clean. The owner was an older man, wiry, with hands thickened by years of work. He paid in cash, which was the main reason I accepted. There was no one else around besides his son, a quiet young man who helped with loading and unloading, but disappeared at dusk without explanation. My tasks were simple at first. Keep the customer areas clean, stack bundles of wreaths, check tags on trees, and guide people to cut their selections. The farm was quiet when customers were gone, and even during the day, it never felt crowded. The trees themselves were mostly unremarkable, just neat rows of varying heights and species. Occasionally, I noticed a tree with a ribbon tied around it. These ribbons weren't the standard red or gold used for sales. They were old, fraying, and faded from sun and weather. They had patterns I didn't recognize, almost geometric or jagged, like something drawn rather than woven. When I glanced at them more closely, I saw that the cloth itself was rough, stiffened over years, and the colors muted to dull creams and grays. I asked the son about them once, simply because curiosity got the better of me. He didn't give much of an answer, just a sharp look, and said not to touch them. I thought nothing of it at first, assuming it was some family practice I didn't need to understand. The farm changed after the first week. Nights grew darker earlier, the cold heavier. I stayed in the small bunkhouse on the property, a single room with a narrow bed, a stove, and a sink. I kept my door closed, the thin walls doing little to block the wind. One night, while folding the last wreaths for the day, I heard something in the woods. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a deer moving through the brush. Then the sound repeated, a series of small, deliberate bells. They weren't sleigh bells, not the kind you hang in a store or on a wreath. They had weight, metallic and clean, jingling rhythmically as though someone was moving through the trees very carefully. The sound traveled in irregular intervals, stopping and starting, never getting closer, never fading entirely. I checked the bunkhouse door, locked it, and went back to stacking wreaths, convincing myself it was probably a hiker or someone lost. Morning came, and I walked the rows to check for damage or mislaid decorations. The trees with ribbons were still there, but now I noticed something else. A few of the marked trees were gone. Not fallen, not cut with the usual saw I was given. Just gone. The ground was clear. No sawdust, no chips, nothing but a bare patch of earth where the tree had stood. I went over the area slowly, scanning for footprints, broken branches, tire tracks, anything to explain it. The soil was undisturbed. I spent the better part of an hour walking the rows before I told myself I must have been mistaken, that I simply didn't notice the clearings before. The nights continued like this. The bells came intermittently, always in the same direction, coming from deep in the woods. I began sleeping with a knife beside my bed, the unfamiliar sound of it against the metal pan of the stove somehow comforting. The farm felt less isolated than it had at first. It felt watched. Not in a human sense, but as if the property itself was alert, and I was an intruder. The sun continued to disappear at dusk without explanation, never staying long enough for me to see where he went. I didn't ask again. The week before Christmas, I noticed a change in my own routine. I started waking up in the middle of the night, shivering, even when the stove was warm. I thought it was just the cold until I felt something against my wrist. I woke fully, reaching to rub the spot, and found a ribbon tied snugly around my wrist. It was the same faded, stiff cloth I had seen on the trees. I couldn't recall putting it there. I remembered locking the door, making sure nothing could get in. I examined it under the dim light, tugging lightly. It didn't fray further. The knot was tight, but not impossible. I removed it, leaving it on the table beside my bed, and stayed awake for the rest of the night. The next morning, Christmas Eve, I packed my things. I didn't speak to the owner, and he didn't ask why I was leaving. He handed me cash for the days I had worked, and that was it. On my drive back down the winding gravel road, the farm disappeared behind me into the folds of forest. I didn't look back. Looking back now, I can trace every detail. The smell of wet pine needles, the stiffness of the ribbons, the pattern of the sound through the trees. But nothing I saw was impossible in a normal sense. There were no figures, no traces of anyone staying in the woods. The bells could have been a trapped deer, a swinging metal sign in the wind, anything. The ribbons might have been a family tradition, something the sun wanted left undisturbed. But for those 2 weeks, every evening felt like it stretched longer than it should, every sound sharper, and every shadow heavier than natural. I've never returned to that area, and I don't know if the farm is still in operation. I remember the feeling of leaving more than anything. The relief, the lingering unease, the strange certainty that I had been part of a system I didn't understand, one that followed rules I had no way of guessing. The farm existed in its own quiet, methodical world, and I was an outsider there for just long enough to notice. That's enough to remember. I haven't sought seasonal work in isolation since. The money wasn't worth it, the quiet wasn't comforting, and the ribbons, tied and untied, remain in my mind as a reminder that some things are better left observed from a distance. I took the Christmas shift because the apartment had started to feel smaller after the divorce papers were signed. The quiet there was thin and sharp. Every sound bounced. Neighbors had trees in their windows and radios tuned to stations that played the same songs on repeat. I had nowhere to go and no one expecting me. The lookout offered a reason to be alone that did not feel like failure. The Forest Service still filled winter posts then, especially after dry summers. Southern Idaho had burned hard that year. Even with snow on the ground, the policy was to keep eyes on the high ridges. Lightning storms could still roll through. Illegal burns still happened. People still got lost. The lookout I drew sat on a bald ridge above the timberline, a square tower on steel legs with a narrow stair and a small cabin perched on top. No road reached it once the snow set in. Access came by snowcat when weather allowed, otherwise by snowshoe if someone was desperate enough. I packed for 4 days. Canned stew, powdered coffee, crackers, oatmeal, a propane heater with a spare tank, a shortwave radio tied into the Ranger network, a paper logbook with a cracked spine and pages yellowed from decades of graphite and weather. The last entry before mine was from the late 70s, written in tight block letters by someone who had clearly learned penmanship in the service. Nobody had bothered to replace it. Nobody expected much to happen up there in December. The snowcat dropped me off on the morning of the 23rd and left without waiting. The engine noise faded fast. Wind took over. The ridge was bare except for the tower, the outhouse half-buried downslope, and a line of stunted firs clinging to the lee side. The sky was clean and pale. Cold sat heavy but stable. I unlocked the hatch, hauled my gear up, bolted the door, and lit the heater. The smell of propane mixed with old dust and pine pitch soaked into the wood. The first day passed slow and clean. I logged weather every hour. Wind direction, speed, cloud cover. Visibility was excellent. The snow below the treeline lay smooth and unbroken. No tracks. No smoke. No movement. That night I slept in my bag on the narrow bunk, listening to the tower flex as gusts came off the ridge. On Christmas Eve the light was sharp. The sun cut long blue shadows across the basin. I spent the morning scanning with binoculars more out of habit than need. Late in the afternoon, as the sun dropped behind the western range, I noticed a series of pale points flicker below the treeline to the south. They were low, close to the ground, and moved slow. They did not blink like aircraft. They did not follow a trail like headlamps. They appeared, shifted, then dimmed, as if masked by trees or terrain. I wrote it down and labeled it reflection. Snow can do strange things at dusk. Ice crystals catch light and scatter it in ways that fool the eye. I stayed on the glass until dark, but nothing else showed. The night settled in hard. Stars came out thick. The basin went black. Christmas Day was colder. Wind dropped. Sound carried. I heard nothing but my own movement and the faint creak of metal as the tower adjusted. The radio worked fine that morning. I checked in, logged the time, logged weather. The day stayed clear. I forced myself to eat. Hunger came late and left fast. After dark, the lights came back. Same area, same elevation. This time there were more of them. They held position longer. They were spaced in a loose line, not straight, not random. I watched them through binoculars until my eyes watered. They were not bright enough to be vehicle lights. They were too steady to be handheld lamps swinging with a person's gait. They did not move uphill or downhill. They shifted sideways, stopped, then shifted again. I logged them as unidentified light movement and added distance estimates based on known landmarks. I told myself it was a snowcat working a lower road, maybe private land. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation and closed the shutters to keep the cold out. That night the radio died. It did not crackle or fade. It went silent as if unplugged. I checked the connections. I checked the power. I reset the unit. Nothing came through. I wrote it down and planned to report it when contact was restored. On the morning of the 26th, the wind picked up from the north. The sky stayed clear. I went down the stairs to check the propane tank and noticed the snow around the base of the tower looked wrong. The surface was compacted in broad, uneven depressions. Not footprints. Not tracks. The snow had been pressed down in wide ovals, overlapping, as if weight had shifted back and forth in place. There were no drag marks. No entry path. The surrounding snow remained untouched. I circled the base and counted the impressions. There were several, arranged around the legs of the tower. I pressed my boot into one. It barely changed. The snow was hard-packed. It would have taken hours of pressure to do that in those temperatures. I climbed back up and locked the hatch. The lights appeared again that night, closer than before. They sat just below the treeline directly beneath the lookout. They did not move much. They stayed there. I did not open the shutters. I wrote observations by lantern light, hands stiff, graphite snapping and smearing on the old paper. I checked the time every few minutes and logged each interval because the routine helped me stay calm. Sometime after midnight, the tower shook in a way that was not wind. It was subtle, a low vibration that traveled up the legs and into the floor. It came and went. The heater rattled. The radio stayed dead. I stayed awake until dawn. Pickup came late that morning. The snowcat broke the silence with a low roar that felt unreal after days of wind and metal. I packed fast. My hands shook from cold and lack of sleep. When I climbed down, the depressions around the base were still there. The operator did not comment. We left tracks as we went, clean and clear, a straight line back toward the road. At the ranger station, I handed in the logbook and filled out a maintenance report for the radio. The duty ranger flipped through the pages, brow tightening. He stopped and asked why I had logged observation of personnel every hour for 12 hours straight on Christmas night. I told him I had not written that. He showed me the page. The handwriting matched mine in shape, but not in pressure. The words were faint, as if written through a sheet. Observation of personnel. Repeated, timed, methodical. The explanation came later, after a meeting I was not invited to attend. A training exercise had been conducted in the basin below the lookout by a federal agency I did not work for. Cold weather surveillance drills. Ground teams practicing static observation under cover of darkness. They used low-intensity lights shielded and angled to avoid detection from a distance. They staged beneath the tower to test whether a lookout could identify them. They stayed in place for hours, rotating weight to avoid frost injury, compacting the snow without leaving tracks. They jammed civilian radios as part of the exercise, within a range that included my post. The snowcat I saw later belonged to them, not the Forest Service. The logbook issue was explained by carbon transfer. The old book had been used with carbon paper decades earlier. Pressure from my writing, repeated hourly, had transferred faint impressions to the page beneath. When the book was examined under proper light, those impressions read as a separate log. Someone interpreted it as an intentional entry. I was told none of this officially. It came through paperwork language and quiet corrections. I was asked to sign a statement acknowledging unusual activity and equipment interference. I signed it. The divorce paperwork had already taught me the value of signatures. I never took another winter shift. The job ended that season. I moved out of the apartment in the spring. What stayed with me was not fear of the dark or the cold. It was the knowledge that I had been watched deliberately, methodically, by people doing their jobs, and that my presence there had been incidental. The lookout did its purpose. I observed. I logged. The system tested itself around me and moved on. I was hired to dress as Santa in December 2019. It was supposed to be simple, a temporary gig for the holiday season. I'd never done it before, but the pay was decent, and I had nothing else lined up. The shopping district was crowded, the streets lined with store lights, and the air carried a sharp winter chill mixed with the scent of pine wreaths and fried food from the nearby food court. I reported to the back of one of the larger department stores, where the costume was kept in a small, unheated storage room. The suit was folded on a metal rack, tucked behind boxes of decorations, and the instant I picked it up, I knew something was off. It was heavy and damp, the fabric carrying a stale, earthy smell that made me wrinkle my nose. It didn't smell like mothballs or detergent. It smelled like it had been stored somewhere underground, away from sunlight and air, and forgotten. I set it on a table, unzipped the plastic covering, and tried to shake it out, but the weight didn't ease. I put it on, and it was tight in odd places, loose in others. The gloves pinched my fingers. The belt was stiff and almost impossible to cinch. The hat sagged, and the beard, a synthetic mess, felt wet on the inside. My reflection in the storage room mirror was distorted, the lights casting shadows across my eyes. I looked older, heavier. The smell was strong enough that I had to step outside for air before I could start. The first few hours were fine. Kids lined up in organized rows, parents hovering close. They whispered wishes, shouted requests, and some were silent, staring with wide eyes. Some of the children asked questions I didn't answer, or made statements that made my stomach twist. One little girl told me I had always been here, and that she had been waiting for me all year. Another boy, about 7, said my eyes were tired, like I had been carrying a long secret. Their parents smiled nervously, like it was some inside joke. I laughed it off. The work was repetitive. Smile, pose, nod, listen, pose again. By late afternoon, my body was sore. The suit didn't breathe, the heat built inside it, and my hands began to tingle from the tight gloves. Sweat soaked through layers of fabric, running down my back, and the damp smell of the costume clung to my hair and skin. The kids continued to come. The statements got stranger. A pair of twins said I had been here when their dad was small, and a small boy refused to look at me, whispering that I looked wrong like always. I tried to focus, to ignore it. Keep moving, keep smiling. The mall emptied slowly as night approached. By 8 o'clock, the last parents dragged their reluctant children past me. I was exhausted, my arms ached from holding children, my back stiff from standing for hours. I went to remove the costume. The zipper jammed. My hands, already slick with sweat, couldn't grip the teeth. I tugged and twisted, but the fabric didn't budge. My breathing quickened. The gloves felt tighter, my fingers cramping. The hat slid over my eyes. I realized I couldn't reach the zipper pull with my bare fingers, and panic started to climb. I tried again and again, shaking violently, my head pressed against the mirror, trying to pull from every angle. The security guard came by. He looked at me, his expression blank, but there was an odd weight in the way he stood. I explained I couldn't get out of the suit. He tilted his head and said something that made my stomach drop. He told me I had been there since before he started working here. My mind reeled. It made no sense. I remembered getting the job that morning, walking into the store, putting on the costume, and then the day had been normal. But the words sank into me. He didn't laugh. He didn't explain. He just left, and the fluorescent lights hummed above me. I tried to force the zipper again. My hands shook so hard I left red marks on the fabric. Sweat poured down my face. The reflection in the mirror made me feel like a stranger. Hours must have passed. My mind was a blur. I remember collapsing against the wall, my legs stiff, arms still pinned in the costume. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, I was at my apartment. How I got there, I couldn't remember. No one had driven me. No one had helped. I stood in the center of my small living room, the suit still on me. My apartment smelled faintly of the same dampness, as if I had carried the suit's environment with me. I tried to remove it again. The zipper didn't budge. My hands were raw, fingertips red and swollen from trying. I discovered the beard had fused in a way that made it impossible to remove. Tugging only made the fibers tear and stick. I tried scissors, a knife, heat from the stove. Nothing worked. It didn't burn, it didn't melt, it didn't tear cleanly. It only resisted, clinging as though it had a weight of its own. I slept in the costume because I had no other choice. The fabric stuck to my skin. The smell never faded. I showered in layers of plastic wrap, trying to wash the damp odor from my body, but it remained, faint but present, clinging like residue. Eating became a chore. Sitting was uncomfortable. Every movement reminded me of the tightness, the weight. I went out once, briefly, to the corner store. People glanced at me, some with recognition, some with curiosity. Children looked away quickly, adults avoided eye contact. Some whispered. Days passed. The suit didn't loosen. The beard stayed. My hands healed, but the gloves never came off. The smell never disappeared. I kept a log, tried everything to remove the costume, soaking, steaming, chemical cleaners. Nothing. I eventually stopped trying. I adapted. My life became routine, dictated by the weight and smell. The costume became me, and I became it. The irony is that it wasn't even Christmas anymore. The mall closed for renovations. The shopping district emptied as stores went out of business. I walked the streets, past empty storefronts, past abandoned decorations and dead wreaths. I realized I didn't miss anything. I didn't mourn the normalcy I had lost. The suit was the only constant. It wasn't supernatural. There were no ghosts, no tricks of the mind, only the fabric, the smell, and the impossible zipper. I learned to live around it. I eat, sleep, and work with the suit. I keep it clean enough to function, but it will never be gone. The beard is permanent. I cannot shave it. I cannot melt it. I cannot cut it. It is stitched into my face, like it has been there for decades. I have grown accustomed to it, but every now and then, when I look in a mirror, the smell hits me like a wave. The weight presses down, and I remember the first day, the little children, the statements, the security guards' words. The experience shaped me, left me changed, and though I live a life outwardly normal, I carry it with me always. Even now, I can touch the zipper, pull at the fabric, and feel the stubborn resistance. I have accepted it. I have learned to navigate the world as Santa, but I cannot explain why. I cannot explain how it happened. I cannot undo it. The costume is a part of me. I am a part of it. The smell, the weight, the beard, all permanent. And in that reality, I continue quietly, moving through the world, unseen, carrying the work of a Christmas that will never end. I no longer work at malls. I no longer see children lined up for photos. I walk through life in the suit, unseen or ignored, a ghost of holiday cheer, but one entirely grounded in the stubborn, physical, impossible reality of the costume that binds me. It is real, and it is mine, and I have no choice but to live in it forever. I went because my grandmother insisted, and because saying no to her felt heavier than the winter coats stacked by the door. She believed some things only mattered if you kept doing them long after they stopped making sense. Midnight Mass was one of those things. The village had emptied out over the years. People moved to cities, crossed borders, died, or simply vanished into other lives. Fewer than 50 remained by the winter of 1986, most of them old enough to remember when the road had still been paved and the train still stopped nearby. I had grown up elsewhere, but Christmas pulled us back like a habit we could not break. We walked to the church through snow that had fallen all afternoon and never fully stopped. The path was faint, packed down by boots that belonged to the same small group of people who used it every year. The building stood at the edge of the village, stone walls dark with moisture, roof bowed slightly from age. There were no power lines running to it. There never had been. The windows glowed from candlelight, uneven and alive, the way fire always looks when it is not contained by glass and switches. Inside, the air smelled of wax, old wood, damp wool, and something metallic that reminded me of blood, though I never saw any. The ceiling disappeared into shadow. Candles lined the walls, the altar, the narrow ledges beneath the icons. Their flames bent whenever the door opened, then steadied again. People filled the pews slowly, coats heavy, movements careful. I recognized faces without knowing names. These were the people who had always been there, even when I was a child, even when I visited less and less. The priest stood near the altar, arranging objects with practiced hands. I watched him longer than I meant to. He wore the same vestments I remembered, or one so similar I could not tell the difference. His hair was dark, his face narrow, his posture straight. He was not the priest from my childhood. I was certain of that. The old one had walked with a limp and smelled of tobacco. This man did not. Still, no one reacted to him as if he were new. They crossed themselves when he passed. They bowed their heads at the right moments. Their bodies knew him. The service began. The words were familiar, though I had not heard them spoken aloud in years. The language felt older than the walls. The sound carried without effort, absorbed by wood and stone and cloth. I stood between my grandmother and a woman whose hands were red and swollen from cold. I noticed how still everyone was. No fidgeting, no coughing, no restless shifting. It felt rehearsed, like a memory being replayed rather than an event happening again. As time passed, a strange clarity settled over me. I began to see details I had not noticed before. The same crease above a man's left eyebrow that I remembered from when I was small. The same chipped tooth visible when a woman parted her lips to breathe. The same thick fingers gripping the edge of a pew. These people had aged, of course. Everyone ages. Yet something about them did not align with the years I knew had passed. The wrinkles sat in the same places. The hands looked worn in the same way. The faces matched older versions stored in my mind with uncomfortable precision. The candlelight did not move much. The air felt sealed. When communion approached, people rose row by row. I watched their backs as they walked forward, each step careful, each pause identical. It struck me then that I could remember each of them exactly, as they were now from visits 10, even 15 years earlier. The realization came without panic at first. It felt like solving a puzzle that had been in front of me for a long time. When my turn came, I felt exposed walking alone down the aisle. The priest looked at me directly. His eyes were clear and steady. There was no warmth in them, but no threat either. He held himself as if he had been standing there for decades, repeating the same motions, seeing the same faces. I returned to my place and sat down, heart working harder than it should have for the short walk. The bells rang at midnight. The sound came from above, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. It marked the moment the year turned inward on itself. I turned toward the door without knowing why. The windows near it were frosted over, opaque with ice and snow. The outline of the door was still visible, but the gap beneath it was gone. Snow had piled against it from the outside, pressed tight. No light passed through. It looked sealed, as if the building had sunk into the ground. I scanned the room again. No one reacted. Heads remained bowed. Faces remained calm. The bells faded. The priest smiled then, not broadly, not kindly, but with recognition. He knew I had noticed. The thought landed fully formed and settled without resistance. I stood before the service ended. The sound of my movement felt loud wrong. Still no one turned. I moved toward the side of the church, past shelves holding old books and cloths, toward the sacristy. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room was smaller, colder. I found a window behind stacked crates and old frames. The latch resisted, then gave way. Snow spilled in when I pushed it open, falling onto the floor in a clean white sheet. I climbed out, dropping into snow up to my knees. The cold bit through my coat. I moved away from the wall, circled until I found a path, then broke into a run. The church remained silent behind me. No footsteps followed. No voices called out. The bells did not ring again. I did not speak about it afterward. My grandmother said nothing either. We returned home, ate, slept. The morning looked normal. The road was there. The houses stood as they always had. The church loomed at the edge of the village, unchanged. Years passed. Life filled in around the memory, dulled it, pushed it aside. My grandmother died. She was buried in the village cemetery beneath a stone that matched many others. 10 years went by before I returned. The village was smaller still. Houses collapsed or boarded up. The road was worse. When I walked toward the edge where the church should have been, I found only uneven ground and weeds. No rubble. No foundation stones. No depression where a building had stood. It was as if nothing had ever been built there. I asked quietly at the municipal office in the nearest town. Records were thin. Old documents lost during administrative changes. Maps redrawn. The church did not appear in any surviving files. There were references to a parish decades earlier, then nothing. No demolition permits. No relocation notices. No photographs. Standing there, the explanation came together slowly, without mystery. The village had been isolated for years. Borders shifted. Authorities changed. Some communities learned to keep themselves invisible. The church had never been registered properly. Services continued without oversight. The priest was assigned unofficially, replaced quietly when needed. The same people attended because they had nowhere else to go. Age looked frozen because I had not seen them often enough to notice the changes. Memory had filled in the gaps. Candlelight hid more than it revealed. Snow blocked a door because storms do that in open fields. Fear sharpened what logic later smoothed. What remained was the understanding that I had stepped into something sustained by repetition and refusal to end. A place where time was managed, not stopped. A ritual kept alive because letting it die would mean admitting the village already had. I did not look for the church again. There was nothing left to find. It was Christmas Eve, 1999, and the storm had already taken the edges off the day. I had left work earlier than usual, hoping to make it home before the roads became impassable. But when I reached the edge of the main highway, the snow was coming down hard, wet, and fast, sticking to everything it touched. The road was slick, the visibility limited to the glow of my headlights cutting through the white. I'd grown up in the region and knew the main thoroughfares could turn treacherous this time of year, so I decided to take a shortcut, a locals-only road that cut through the hills and avoided the long, winding stretch along the river. I knew it was supposed to be closed for the season, but my truck handled snow well, and I figured I could save an hour if I went that way. The shortcut started out narrow, barely more than a lane in some places, flanked by tall pines and bare deciduous trees whose branches sagged under the weight of the snow. The world outside my windshield was already becoming indistinct, like a painting being blurred with water. My tires crunched over the thickening layer of snow, and I kept a steady, cautious pace. The wind gusted now and then, pushing the flurries sideways, making it feel as though the world outside was closing in. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of my heater working overtime and the occasional scrape of my windshield wipers. About 20 minutes in, the road began to twist more sharply than I remembered, and the snow was falling so hard that I could no longer see the tree line clearly. The shortcut had always been isolated, but now it felt like there was nothing but the snow and my headlights. I had to squint and slow my truck to navigate the curves safely. Then, out of the white haze, I saw it, a house. The lights were on, warm and steady, and a wreath hung on the door, perfectly centered, with red berries that glowed faintly in the snowfall. My first thought was that someone had stayed up late decorating for Christmas, a comforting, almost cinematic image. I pulled into the driveway, the snow muffling the sound of my tires against the packed ice, and walked up to the door, the cold biting at my face through the thin gloves I had. I knocked, and the door opened almost immediately. Inside, it was warm, the air dry and carrying the faint scent of pine and something sweet like baking. A family greeted me, polite and quiet, offering me space to warm up. Their movements were careful, unhurried, and the house felt lived in but preserved, as if it hadn't been touched in a long while. The walls were decorated with simple holiday touches, the furniture worn but maintained, and a small fire crackled in the hearth. The clock on the wall caught my attention immediately. It read 6:15. I glanced away for a moment and back again. The hands hadn't moved. I assumed it was stopped, a minor oversight, and it didn't seem like something to dwell on. I was grateful for the heat, the quiet company, and the sense of normalcy in the middle of the storm. The family didn't ask questions about where I was headed or why I had taken the shortcut, which felt polite but a little strange. I took off my wet coat and gloves, sat near the fire, and let the warmth seep into my body. Outside, the storm continued, but inside, there was a sense of calm, almost too careful, too exact. Every movement in the kitchen, every placement of a dish on the table was deliberate. I had noticed this when I walked in, but I brushed it off as the result of being tired and cold. Time seemed to slow. I watched the snow pile up against the windows, the wind flaring it into the bare branches just outside. My truck was parked at the end of the driveway, headlights still faintly glowing through the falling snow. I tried to ignore the creeping thought that something about the house felt off, but I was tired, cold, and the storm outside made the warmth of the house almost magnetic. After a while, I decided it was safe enough to leave, thinking the storm might let up for the drive back to the main road. I thanked the family, feeling a little guilty for not staying longer, and stepped back into the snow. The wind hit immediately, whipping against my coat, and the cold stung sharply. I started the truck, watching the driveway carefully, and eased back onto the road. The snow was still heavy, but the headlights cut a path wide enough for me to drive cautiously. I had been on the road for about 5 minutes when the headlights of a plow truck appeared, moving slowly but steadily toward me. I pulled over to the side and stopped. The driver got out, shaking snow off his coat, and motioned me over. I leaned out the window, and he told me that no one had lived on that road since a fire in the 70s. He said it plainly, without any hint of amusement or disbelief. I asked him about the house, and he looked at me carefully, almost studying me. Then he asked how I knew where it used to be. I didn't answer at first. I didn't know what to say. The house had been there, with lights and a wreath, with a family that moved and breathed and carried themselves in the snowstorm. The driver shook his head and went back to his plow. I stayed there for a moment longer, staring at the road I had just come from. The snow fell relentlessly, covering every sign of the path I had taken, as if erasing it. My mind tried to reconcile the warmth, the fire, the scent of pine and baking, with the fact that, according to him, there was nothing there. I started the truck again, moving slowly back to the main highway. The rest of the drive home was quiet, the snow still falling but thinning as I descended into lower elevations. I kept thinking about the house, the clock, the family, and the way everything had felt so normal, so precise. When I finally reached my own street and pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for a long time, just breathing and letting the storm fade into the edges of memory. I still don't understand what I saw that night. The road had been closed, and yet I had taken it, and I had found something that, for a few hours, felt utterly real. I haven't returned to that road since, not even in summer. The memory of the warmth inside, the quiet, and the snow outside is sharp. Every Christmas Eve, when the weather turns and the snow starts to fall, I think of that house. I think of the clock and the precise movements of the family. I think of the plow driver's question, how I knew where it used to be. And I realize that sometimes, the world holds places that exist perfectly in a moment, and then vanish without explanation, leaving nothing behind but a trace in memory.